Today, I'm going to tell you about a man who holds many accomplishments. He is a world champion fencer, he is a virtuoso violinist, he is a revolutionary, and more. He was born Joseph Boulogne. He went by Le Chevalier de Saint George, but he is remembered as Mozart Noir, or the Black Mozart. So, today I'm going to tell you about who this man was, his many accomplishments, and why he deserves to be remembered not as the Black Mozart, but as who he chose to be, which is Le Chevalier de Saint George. So, he was born Joseph Boulogne on Christmas Day to a rich white colonialist and his very young slave mistress. So there was very little chance for him to be successful on the island of Guadeloupe where he was born because everyone was very racist, and of course he was born of mixed race, which was very scandalized at the time. So in 1753 his family brought him to Paris to begin his studies, and his father was very wealthy and considered to be a gentleman of the king's chamber. So this afforded him a lot of opportunities that wouldn't typically be given to people who were born of mixed race during this time period. He actually started practicing fencing and horsemanship at the age of 13. As he grew older, by 17 he was already one of the best fencers in Paris. And still a student, he was challenged by master fencer Alexander Picard, who was basically going around the country using racial slurs and terrible things to refer to Chevalier de Saint George. And eventually, Saint George accepted his challenge, and again, still a student, beat this master fencer. He won. Very little is known about his music background before this, but it's still full of scandal, don't worry. So having mastered fencing, St. George moved on to music. He was very good at the violin, he composed operas, he composed all sorts of different types of music. He became so well known and so famous that he had a great scandal, as all great musicians do, which is the 1776 Paris Opera scandal. So he was a shoo-in for the position of the lead director at the Paris Opera, but the three singers, presumably sopranos, were just shocked that they would ever consider putting someone who was mixed race at the head of the opera. So they wrote a very nasty letter to Queen Marie Antoinette and said explicitly, we're going to leave the opera if you put someone of mixed race in charge. So Chevalier de Saint George was actually good friends with Marie Antoinette, and totally on the side note, rumored to have had a scandal with her as well. No evidence though, so it's not in this presentation. So he actually stepped down from this position to avoid embarrassing her because he cared about her and she was his friend. Also, he was the only one qualified for this position, so they just didn't have a director of the opera after this because that's how badly they didn't want him. A lot of people remember him as the Black Mozart because he has very similar musical style to Mozart, and Mozart's death and scandal made him very popular. So instead of remembering Chevalier de Saint George, who actually came first and whom Mozart drew inspiration from and actually lived with during a period of his life, we remember Mozart and not Chevalier de Saint George. As if being a world master fencer and a world famous musician was not good enough, he actually went on to join the French Revolution and Reform movement. So he was the colonel of the first all men of color regiment in Europe on the side of the Republic. And he won several battles for them. And once they started beheading the king and other royal people, they betrayed him and threw him in jail because he was a wealthy person. So they left him in jail from somewhere between 11 to 13 months, periodically letting him know that he was scheduled to be beheaded. And he actually made it out okay. After the Republic decided they were done beheading people, he eventually petitioned his way out of jail, but was more or less forced out of the country because nobody wanted him around anymore. So that's just devastating. But he did all sorts of cool things that I don't have time to talk about today beyond these things. He was nicknamed the God of Arms. He was an officer of the king. He wrote all kinds of music. He was the first classical composer with African ancestry, and rumors of all kinds of love affairs, married women and not, and US President John Adams called him the most accomplished man in Europe. So basically, Chevalier de St. George is super awesome. Please stop calling him the Black Mozart and remember him for who he is.
Hell yeah!
Quality boys.
Yeehaw.
That was great!
Ooh.
Questions?
Does he have any well-known pieces that are still performed and circulated today?
Yes. There's a really great website that has excerpts from pretty much all of his surviving pieces. Well, I guess I don't know that. But a lot of his surviving pieces, and I did find several all-black groups, like from Chicago and a couple places around the world, who perform his music as all-black groups. And that was
that's awesome.
And there was a fairly recent documentary about him, which is where I got some of those images from, and that included a lot of his music.
So now we just need Lin-Manuel Miranda to
That's part of
do
Friends.
a play about him.
Hell yeah.
Someone call him. That'd be a great play.